second episode of Let's Get Quilting. My name is Maureen and I am a quilter, and I am going to help you step by step make a quilt. So in the first episode we talked about where to buy fabric, what to do with the fabric when you got it home, and how to cut out the fabric. So using the rotary cutter, a ruler, and of course the mat. So these three things we talked about in detail, and then we made some cutting with some strips in order to make our first block, which is going to be the 9-patch block. And these are 3.5-inch strips sewn together, cut, and then sewn again in order to make a 9-patch. So at the end of the first episode, we should have had 2 light fabric strips and 2 dark fabrics. We have these, 2 and 2. And now we're going to come to the fun part, and we're going to sew them together to make the 9-patch block. Before we get to the sewing part, I did want to mention one item that I didn't mention last episode, and that is the cutting table. If you notice, my cutting table is quite high. This is just a standard folding table that you buy at the home supply, Lowe's, Home Goods, Amazon, whatever. And mine is 6 feet long and originally it's 29 and a half inches high. So for me, that would be, I'm 5'8", so for me, I would be bending over a lot in order to cut my fabric. And I saw this tip in a quilting magazine, and it has been a godsend. So what they said was, in order to raise your table, is that you buy 1.5-inch PVC pipe, again at your local home good store, Lowe's, Home Goods, plumbing supply place. And you want, for me, I needed my table higher than 29.5 inches. So I wanted it's probably about another 10 inches. So my husband cut the PVC pipe to 15 inches, and then we attached it to the, just put it on the legs until they couldn't go any further. And I just put batting on the bottom, and so it doesn't scratch my floors. And now my table is 38.5 inches. So when I'm cutting, I'm no longer bending over and hurting my back. I can now cut with a straight back. And let me say that if you're cutting a lot of fabric and you're at the cutting table for a long time, that really does wear and tear on your back. So if you can put a table in a solid space and do this, it would really help you a lot. But if you can't, and if it has to be, folded up each time, you can certainly still do that, where you can just take the legs off and fold the table. So now we get to what I think is the most important part, is sewing our blocks together, our strips together, so in order to make the quilt. There are a few things that I wanted to talk about before we even start sewing, and that is what's needed around the sewing machine and a little bit of maintenance for the sewing machine. So, when I just mean maintenance, I mean like keeping the machine clean, dust-free. I do a little bit of routine maintenance so that my machine doesn't have dust bunnies in it, and then it runs smooth and my stitches are nice and even. Usually on, I'd say, a yearly basis, or maybe a year and a half, but I try to do it yearly, is I bring it to the place that I bought my machine, and I have it looked over, and he does the oiling and, looks at the stitch length and everything, and so to me that's really important to do. And then I do certain maintenance at home that helps me feel better about my machine, and so I'd like to go over those little bit of tips that I do now so we can get going. First thing I thought we should talk about, like I said, is the maintenance of the machine. I have a routine where I have 4 bobbins, and once 3 of those bobbins are emptied, then I do my routine maintenance. By taking the cover off and going in and looking at for all the dust. So first we're going to take the cover off of the machine in order to get to the underneath part where the bobbin is kept and also where all the dust decides to accumulate. So the first thing we're going to do is take off this silver cover in order to get underneath so that we can get all the dust out. So in your packet, when your instrument or your machine came to you, you should have maybe a screwdriver or a little key so that you can undo the screws here. I have 2 screws, one here and one here. Yours may have more, may have less, I don't know. So the first thing I have to do is take out the bobbin cover, as I can't take out this silver cover without taking off the bobbin cover. So for me, mine just snaps out, and I put that aside, and then I take my key and I undo my screws. Okay, so once the screws are out, I can lift up this cover, and now I can get into the guts of the machine. Now we have the cover off, and now we need to get the bobbin out of here. So I take my bobbin out, and I take the bobbin casing out, and then I can use a brush that they gave me to clean out the inside. Also, but if you don't have a brush, you could buy a paintbrush at one of the hobby stores, and that would really help you get, the fine little dust bunnies out of there. So what I do is I take the brush and I just sweep all around, and I make sure that I get all the dust out, and I go into all the crevices. The other thing that I use quite frequently is a pipe cleaner. Where's the pipe cleaner? So here's the pipe cleaner. So you can get these at a 5 and dime store, the old-fashioned pipe cleaners. And I use this to be able to get really into the nooks and crannies, and so that I can get the dust out. So as I said, I tend to do this after I've used my 3rd bobbin. When I'm ready to put the 4th bobbin in, I take apart the machine and I do my cleaning. And then I know I'm ready to start again and everything is nice and clean. Okay. So now that we have our sewing machine all back together and it's all nice and clean, we can start what I think is the most exciting part, is sewing. We can put our blocks together, and then once our blocks are together, we sew them in rows, and then we can make the final quilt. The 2 things that I like to hold by my sewing machine at all times is a small pair of very sharp scissors and a seam ripper. Now, if you're like me, you will come to have a love-hate relationship with this little guy. In that, I mean, I love it that it rips out the seams very fast, and I hate it because I have to rip out seams. But everybody rips out seams, so, or maybe I just rip out more seams than I need to. I have no idea. The most important thing that you want to concentrate on when you are sewing a quilt is to make sure that you have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. This is extremely important. All patterns are designed for 1/4 of an inch seam allowance in quilting. So if you don't have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, your quilt block is going to be off. It's either going to be too large because you have too small a seam, or it's going to be too small because you've taken too big a seam. So right off the bat, you want to make sure that you have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, or you know how to achieve that on your sewing machine. Now there are 1/4 of an inch seam allowance feet that you can buy, or it may come with your sewing machine. So if you don't have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance foot that either you can purchase for your machine, or if it came with your machine, you can easily achieve the same process by using your standard foot. This is how I've been shown to do it. So what I take is just a small scrap of fabric, and I use just the basic foot that comes with my machine, okay? And I line up the edge of the fabric, or a little scrap, to the edge of the foot. Put my needle down. So I just sew for a little bit, and these are just the straight factory settings on my machine. I want to see how far off I am on a 1/4 of an inch. So what I have this, I do have this little nifty, it says right, seems right. That's what it's called, seems right. I don't know if you can see that okay. And what it is, it shows you from a 1/4 of an inch, or actually an 1/8 of an inch, all the way to 2 inches to see if your seam is as wide as it should be or if it's too big. So I want the 1/4 of an inch ones right next to my seam, and it is off by just a little bit. I don't know if you can, hopefully you can see that. So that was just a little bit wider than a 1/4 of an inch seam. So what we want to do is we're going to repeat the process over and over, moving our needle over to the right hand side until we get a 1/4 of an inch seam from the edge. So I'm going to move my needle over, and it seems, you know, and then I'll do it again. I line my fabric, little scrap, edge up to the edge of my foot. I put my needle down and I start to sew. And then I'm going to measure it again. And this time when I measure it, when I place this right up against the stitches and then again up against the cut part of the fabric, it's exactly a 1/4 of an inch seam. So that's what I want to achieve. So how do we keep our fabric from moving back and forth? I mean, we're only human, and we, you know, our hands move. So what I have seen done is you take some tape. I just have painter's tape here, and I lower my presser foot, and I put the tape right up against the edge of my foot, and I like to put a couple of pieces, kind of give it like a little edge, again right up against the foot. And I also, because I like to mark where I am in my position of my needle, okay? So I've moved my needle over to the right, And so mine is at 5.0 and 2.3 stitches. So this is the important number to put down. Now when I go to make that 1/4 inch seam, again I'm just going to use a scrap of fabric. I'm going to line that fabric up against this edge of the tape, and I am going to go ahead and sew. And as long as I keep the fabric up against the piece of tape and to the edge of this presser foot, I should have a nice 1/4 inch seam. And I do. No, not really. Now we are ready to sew our 3.5 inch strips together in order to make our 9-patch block. The one thing I found when I was practicing on this block was, okay, so we have our 3.5 inch strip, the width of the fabric, and that is salvage to salvage. And so it's, I don't know, 42 inches long. And what we are going to do is at the fold, right here at the fold, we are going to cut it in half. And the reason we're going to do that is going to be evident as we move along, so that we can sew a few of the strips together. So now we're going to sew a dark and a light together in order to start our making of our block. Always keeping in mind the 1/4 inch and sewing on a straight line. So first you want to line them all up, so right sides together. Okay, so we have right sides together, and now we can sew. The one thing that I use when I do piecing is I use little, what I call little leaders, and they're about an inch, an 1.5 inch to 2 inch scraps of fabric that I keep next to my sewing machine. And what they do is they kind of like, I use them to start and stop when I'm piecing together blocks, in that then I don't have to cut individually after each sewn piece. To the end of my leader, I stop my machine because I want to put in my 2 pieces. Okay, again, right sides together, and I'm going to put them in. I'm going to put the edge of my fabric up to this flange, and then I'm going to stop my machine. We're getting to the end of our strip, and I have another leader where I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to put it right near the end, and as my fabric moves, I'm going to move this leader right underneath the needle. So now I can cut away the strip. I cut away the top leader, and we'll save those. I usually use them a few times before I throw them away. And now we have our first 2 strips. So now that we have the strips sewn together, we want to iron it so that the seam is going to face towards the dark fabric. How I do it is I put it so it's right side up, the fabric, it's right side, and then I kind of take the fabric that I'm going to iron towards, and I hold it in my left hand, and I hold it upright, and I just kind of move the iron so that the seam set. So now we're going to put the other strip on. So I have a light, a dark, and a light. So this one needs to be sewn, so we're going to turn it so it's right sides together. And again, I will start with a leader underneath my needle, and that is from the end of the first strip. It'll be the beginning of the next strip. So all I have to do is line my fabric up to hit the flange of this 1/4 inch foot and hit the go button. So now I have 3 strips sewn together, a light, a dark, and a light. And we are going to press this one. Again, we're going to press it towards the dark side. Our first strip of fabric sewn together, a pieced fabric, and again, they're pressed into the dark side of the fabric. Now we're going to do the same with 3 other strips of fabric, only this time it's going to be the light in the middle and the 2 dark on the sides. So we're going to have dark, light, dark, as opposed to light, dark, light. So we want they have to be opposite each other in order for this block to work. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these together. Now what I am going to do after I sew them, dark, light, and dark, I am going to press it so the seams go outward. And I will show you why we do this and why it's so important to do. Now we have two sets of strips. A light, a dark, and a light. A dark, a light, and a dark. Opposites. And when we went and ironed them, we ironed the first one to the dark, so the inside, and on this one we ironed it to the outside. Now this will become important when we go to match up our seams. This is called nesting, when you have a seam so that they butt together but they're not like really thick. And so that's why we always, when we're doing strips or when we're doing blocks, we tend to iron in the direction that is shown to us so that our seams are not so bulky. Now we are going to cut this strip of fabric, and we're going to cut it into 3.5 inch strips. Let's see. I'll line my horizontal onto a line, so I'm going to just pick any line here, and I'm going to put this strip of fabric onto this line, and where the line intersects, I'm going to have this one hanging over just a tad. So there it is. It's lined up on that, just on that line, so I have something to go by. And then this one is just a little bit off. So now, if I take my ruler and I put it right on the vertical line, right there. So we're going to cut right here. So I'm going to take my rotary cutter, open it, and I'm going to just close my rotary cutter and take this and throw that away. And now I have a straight edge in which to measure my 3.5 inches inward. So at 3.5 inches, 1, 2, 3 1/2. And I'm going to need 2 of those. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the dark, light, and dark. Okay, so now I have my center and I have my 2 outside pieces. And when sewn together, they will make the finished block. So this is where it became important in the pressing. So as you can see, when I turn this right sides together, these ones go inward. These ones go outward. And when I go to sew them together, I'm going to nest And let me zoom in so you can see this. I'm going to nest these two pieces of fabric together. As you can see, they then sit very nice and neat, and they don't have a lot of bulk. If I had pressed both of them to the same side, they will be very bulky. But if I do one to the other, it eliminates that bulkiness, and that's what we want, because as our quilt gets bigger and bigger and our blocks get bigger and bigger, we don't want the bulkiness. So we really want to pay attention to where we are pressing our seams. And just like that, we have a finished block. So what I did was I sewed the two sides together, and then when I finished, I pressed the seams open. And I did this because I want to control the amount of bulk as the quilt gets bigger and bigger. And that's important when you finish the quilt, when you're quilting the 3 layers together, you eliminate some of the bulk. So here it is. Here's our 9-patch block. And again, once we make it so that when we use the dark strips together, then we'll have one that is contrast to this one. So there they are. They're the 2 blocks. This is where we're going to end episode 2. We've talked about many things this episode, including the sewing machine, the importance of a 1/4 of an inch seam, the importance of ironing correctly to reduce our bulk, and we also were able to sew together our first block, which is our 9-patch block. And depending on where you placed your material, your light and your darks, will depend on what block that you achieve. So this is so exciting. And now for our next episode, we are going to make the Old Maid's Puzzle, this block is called. And in this episode, we will make what they call half-square triangles, which look very difficult, but in reality, they're simple. So we're going to work on that and a few other things, and we'll have a block done by the end of next episode. So I will see you then when we get quilting.